great to join all of you. I'm really excited to talk about appropriations. I think it's the coolest and most interesting part of your government that you likely didn't learn in civics class or in high school government. But in large part, it's the actual meat and potatoes of how the government spends its money and the priorities as it has. Just very quick background: I was an appropriator, legislative director in the House, worked both in the Senate as well, and so this is my bread and butter, and excited to talk with you about it, give an overview of the process, and obviously our additional panelists can provide additional detail, but want to give you a sense of how appropriations fits into the broader congressional context, and then also just the calendar and way to think about appropriations from a 12-month perspective. So Caitlin, let's move on. So just really quick here, a number of you, of course, if you're familiar with this world, the difference between authorizations and appropriations to kind of give a sense of what in the world we're talking about. Authorization is largely policy-related provisions, and so a program should do X, Y, and Z, or a benefit should be A, B, C. Appropriations is the actual money going to individual programs and accounts in the federal government. And so we'll talk about the different types of appropriations bills, the committees that have jurisdiction over there, and then the process of appropriations itself, and then have time for a little bit of a discussion. So again, as I mentioned before, authorization versus appropriations, this is a way to see when you're looking at a particular bill, understanding whether it is an authorizing or an appropriating bill. You can see we have authorizing on the left and appropriations on the right. And the thing to note especially is that the power of appropriations is specifically called out in the Constitution in the Article 1 powers of Congress. And so, and you can see that in the highlighted provision there from Section 9. And so it's an integral part of what Congress does, is determine how federal tax dollars, the actual money from the federal government, is spent. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, there's a number of different types of appropriations bills and appropriations methods. So this is where, for all of you as advocates or those that are interested in this space, can be taking some notes and be thinking about, for your priorities and for the folks that are going to be following after me, how do you execute your advocacy goals in the appropriation space? So the first type is what's called a regular appropriations bill. Typically, they involve an omnibus bill, so the end of the year Christmas tree bill, as it's sometimes referred to as the big funding bill, to essentially pay for that next fiscal year. And so typically, that either has to be passed at the end of the fiscal year, which of course at the end of September, or which typically happens if can is kicked down the road a couple months and the final omnibus bill is passed in December. Continuing resolution is one of those bills that allows you to kick that can down the road. It essentially is a stopgap funding where it provides the appropriated dollars for the previous fiscal year for a set period of time. And then the supplemental appropriations bills, we've seen a number of those recently. Examples of those can include like supplemental funding for the fighters in Ukraine, or response to disaster relief from a hurricane or a flood or something like that. Those are the three types of bills themselves, but in the actual methods, the actual provisions, there's three. Typically, the most common is programmatic funding. That's the amount of money that the respective department can spend on a particular program. And so, Congress will appropriate $10 million for a program to help, I don't know, those struggling with housing insecurity. That's an appropriating programmatic provision. Report language going with this example would be, in executing that programmatic goal, the agency needs to do X, Y, and Z. So report language could be, the committee is concerned about the Department of Health and Human Services inattentiveness to veterans that are struggling with housing insecurity. That would be an example of report language. It's a way to steer and have parameters perhaps and other values in how the money is actually implemented and executed on behalf of the tax dollars, but by the executive branch. And then the third is community project funding or congressionally directed spending in the Senate, broadly known colloquially as earmarks. That's congressionally directed spending money appropriated for a specific constituent-based project, whether that's money to help rebuild a school, to provide technology in a hospital setting, and those were not available for over 10 years. But have since come back. Last year was the first year of using earmarks in over a decade, and this year we're doing them again. So next slide, please. And then what should be a little apparent here, the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee are the committees that have jurisdiction over the actual spending of money. And typically these members are generally not firebrands. They're generally pretty consensus, pretty middle of the road, and are willing to work together because the steering committee determines who gets on on what committees. And so the Appropriations Committee tends to be pretty serious members and carry a lot of weight as to the bills that are actually done by their committees that determine funding levels. We'll talk about that on the next slide. So there's 12 subcommittees, and so by extension, there's 12 appropriations bills that Congress has to pass every year, or those different departments shut down. It's as simple as that. And so each of these subcommittees are responsible for crafting a bill every year. And different committees do it differently. Some of them do a full markup process. They'll pass a bill to go to the floor. Others write a bill, and then it gets thrown into that end-of-year omnibus that we were talking about with a couple days to look at. And there are different political reasons and calculations for why certain bills would take more time on the floor, no time on the floor. That just depends on the political context that the majority for either chamber is dealing with. And so for a lot of our purposes here, health and human services, educational agencies, LAHSE is oftentimes how it's referred to, is where a lot of the federal programs for health programs are included, obviously. Next slide, please. So then I'm just going to breeze through the calendar here and then get over to our other panelists as well. But I think it's helpful to take this out of the abstract. What are these types of funding bills? What are the types of methods? And then think through, what does it actually look like year to year in the calendar perspective? And so the first thing we're going to talk about here is the president's budget. And the president's budget is largely a statement of the administration's funding values and policy priorities. But as a force of law, it has none. Congress is responsible for drafting and funding the government and deciding those appropriations funding levels. But the budget does provide a guide as to if the political context on the Hill, right? If the president's party controls both chambers on the Hill, the budget may contour into the final appropriations bill, or it might contrast it pretty differently if it's a divided government, either in the chambers or in the White House. Next slide, please. Oh, and here's just an example of the president's budget from fiscal year 23. It's helpful to understand where their priorities are, but you shouldn't conclude, though, that if the budget requests an X amount of money for a program, that's necessarily going to be appropriated by Congress. It just doesn't work that way. It often indicates the administration's priority, but it's ultimately up to Congress to determine that. And I guess a great example would be during the Trump administration, their budget continually had different cuts to different health programs. It was not particularly planned of health research, but Congress essentially said, we're not going to listen to that. We're going to continue to appropriate funds for these departments. And even examples like NIH, they saw massive increases under the Trump administration. So again, underscoring the broader point is that Congress is very much in charge, only in charge in the funding and determining the differences in those funding levels for the federal government. Next slide, please. So the first thing we do procedurally in Congress when we're setting up the appropriations process is we have to agree to a budget resolution. And that's next slide. It's basically the instructions for determining what's possible in the appropriations space. And so each of the House committees have to come up with, well, the Appropriations Committee comes with essentially what's called the baseline, or the amount of money that they're going to consider appropriating. And then if you use this resolution also for reconciliation, that's what the second picture is. Each of the committees are then charged with setting up savings that can then be used to appropriate money through a reconciliation bill. That's a supplemental appropriations bill, the third type that we mentioned there. And this is an example here of that concurrent resolution, or that CR that they set up in order to begin the appropriations process. Next slide. And then that's what happens in April. So March and April, you typically have the budget resolution. In April, you do the individual member deadlines. Next slide, we'll give an example for that. So as outside advocates and non-members of Congress, you can make a request to a member. You can't directly yourself make the submission to the committee. The committee submissions are done by members. And so typically members that are on those committee have more weight for certain priorities, but off committee members, and so for all those members, 300 and change or so in the House, and then well over half the Senate that aren't on a committee, it's their prerogative to highlight their priorities to the committee. And so here's an example from Congresswoman Del Bene she set an internal deadline last year for April 13th for 2022. Now, what she did then is all of the requests come in and the staff review them, and then they decide what they want to submit to committee as their priorities. And that is a real indicator of what that member ultimately really cares about in the appropriation space. What are they willing to put their name on? And so this is the chance where anyone can make a programmatic funding request, or report language request, or community project funding if you comply with the new rules on that process. And so that's your first step. That's right. You make a request to a member of Congress and say, hey, I would really appreciate it if you included our priority in your formal requests. Next slide. And then there's the actual subcommittee deadlines of the committees themselves. Remember those 12 subcommittees that we talked about. So the member deadline always precedes the subcommittee deadline because they need time to review and figure out what their priorities are going to be and then submit them to the subcommittee. Next slide, please. And here's an example of like what submission instructions can look like for members. And so you have internal deadlines there that they all need to meet. And so that's always a flurry of activity. So the advice always generally is getting into the members that you're submitting to as early as possible because the amount of requests are just overwhelming. And so trying to establish that relationship, but then also get it done ahead of time is really helpful. Next slide, please. And then in June and July, this is what I remember really well as an appropriator LD, and then for former staff on the call, I remember too. This is where the House tends to mark up, which is to make changes, amend, and then pass their various appropriations bills. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, Congress has to pass 12 in order for all the different departments to get their funding, but not all get markups necessarily, and not all are considered on the floor. And so here's an example a couple of years ago. This is the one I was at when we were marking up the labor HHSC bill. And then you can see on the right, there's a package of 7 subcommittee bills that were passed at the same time. That's done for a variety of political reasons, obviously, but that's the procedure. In June and July, this tends to happen. And then on the next slide, you'll see that the Senate does this a little bit differently. You can go to the next slide, please. The Senate tends to do this later in the year, and they tend to do it over August and October. Next slide, please. And it's up in the air to the degree in which that they have full markups and will pass bills on the floor. As you'll notice, last year and for previous years, a lot of the ultimate funding bills were written primarily by the Senate. And so you can't take the lack of formal markups or proceedings as disengagement, and rather they're doing a lot of deal making and consensus building behind the scenes that is then unveiled oftentimes in that end of year omnibus bill. But this is just an example of when you can watch a Senate markup bill for labor HSE. Next slide, please. And then October 1, as we mentioned, that's where you get the expiration of funding for that previous fiscal year. And so next slide, please. Unless Congress appropriates that continuing resolution or an omnibus, the government does shut down. And so typically that is the first choke point in this process to ensuring that the appropriations priorities that Congress has is actually enacted into law. And so, as I mentioned before, we talked about the continuing resolution. That's often that stopgap appropriations bill that allows Congress time in order to negotiate a final end of year bill. Next slide, please. And then in October through December, that's where the omnibus negotiations are taking place. Typically like December 15th, December 16th is pretty traditional for continuing resolutions or CRs. And then the hopeful idea, in the next slide, please, is that in December, that's where Congress finally agrees to the appropriations bill, the omnibus bill. Typically, they're called the Consolidated Appropriations Act for that particular fiscal year. So this is an example of what that bill looked like, and you can look it up on congress.gov right now, and then the actual enacted text for itself. And so in that bill, they funded all 12 subcommittee bills, and then all the different federal agencies that rely on federal dollars. And so that's the process. And then on the next slide, you see is that next year we get to do this all over again. And so we do this in December, and then before you know it, in February, the president's budget is out and we're off to the races.